Just make sure. Okay, so recorded started. Anybody that has questions, as I say, pop them in the chat or the Q&A, or raise your hand if you'd like to speak. And I'm going to hand over to Peter Thompson now, who is the Chief Executive of the HFEA and who is going to tell us all about the changes to laws that are coming into effect and how this is going to affect people on a fertility journey. So thank you so much, Peter. Over to you.
Thank you, Claire. And it's although I can't see you all, it's lovely to know you're all there, and I'm delighted to speak to you today. What I'm going to do, I think, is just share a few slides with you for 10 minutes or so, and then perhaps we can go with questions from there. So let me just see if I can share my screen first. Can everyone see that?
It's good for me. I'm assuming it's okay for everyone else.
Okay, fantastic. Right,
thank
you. It's lovely to talk to you all today. I want to talk to you really about a consultation that we've got going at the moment about how the fertility laws in the UK might be modernised. I should say at the start, this isn't a decision of the HFEA, this is for government and ultimately Parliament. But in a way, you've got to start somewhere, and I'll talk to a bit about how we've started and what we're going to cover. So let me with a bit of, there we go. Okay, right. Clearly, so Britain's fertility laws are in an act of Parliament called the Human Fertilisation Embryology Act in 1990. So it is over 30 years old. And when the HFEA, which came into being because of that act, sort of celebrated its 30th birthday, back in 2020 or so, we felt that that was a good marker to start a kind of conversation about how the fertility laws in this country might need to be modernised. That work was unfortunately delayed because of COVID, but we sort of picked up speed a bit in last year in 2022 and set up an advisory group of people, scientists, people who work in clinics, and indeed a representative of patient organisations to help advise us on where they thought the law was sort of showing its age, if you like. And at the same time, we talked to the Department of Health, and we've had public ministerial support that we should be undertaking this work. And because of all that, we got to a point where at the back end of February this year, we launched a consultation, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. And if nothing else, what I really want you to do is encourage you to fill in the consultation, and I'll come to how you do that in a moment. So as I said, the consultation launched at the end of February, and it runs until the 14th of April. So it's got a bit over two and a bit weeks to run. And frankly, we're keen to get views, and we've got a lot in already, from anyone, whether you work in fertility services, you use fertility services, you're interested in research or anything else. I mean, really, we hope to get the widest range of views we possibly can. The consultation is all online, and I'll repeat this endlessly throughout tonight. If you go to our website, which is hfea.gov.uk, you can very easily find the consultation. It's an online consultation, and we've divided the issues we're talking about into 4 key themes, if you like, and I'll talk through what's involved in those in a minute. But those key themes were developed with, as I say, this sort of advisory group and some patient stakeholder groups and others. And the consultation itself online, effectively, for each section, we have a short summary of what's the current situation, what's the current issue. We set out some proposals for change, and then there's a few questions about it. And crucially, although what I'm going to talk about in a minute covers a wide range of things, you don't have to be interested in everything to give a view. So this is not one of these consultations where you have to diligently work your way through endless questions in order to say the thing you wanted to say. It's structured in such a way, if you're only interested in one part of the consultation, then that's all you need to answer. Equally, if you're interested in all of it, that's great too. So we've designed it very much so that, as I say, we attract the widest possible audience, if you like, to give their views. And I'll say a little bit about what will happen afterwards later. So what are these 4 themes then? We think, if you like, that the Act, the 1990 Act, the law in the UK, has actually stood the test of time remarkably well. But if you like, there are 4 themes where it's really showing its 30-odd-year-old age. One of those concerns, and I'll talk about each one of these in detail in a minute. So the 4 themes are, firstly, patient safety. Then we think there is a real issue with the way in which people can currently access donor information. Then there's a question about consent. I think any of you who've been patients will know how complex consent is in this area. And then there's the final section of the consultation is about science and research, and I'll say a bit more about that when I get there. So what I thought I'd do in each case is just give you a brief overview of each of those themes and the kind of issues we're looking at. So let's take them in turn. So patient safety. I think there are 3 things we've tried to identify here. The first of which relates to the actual regulatory powers that the HFEA has, because as I think, as many of you will know, we're the regulator for this area of treatment. And at present, actually, the powers we've got are pretty limited. And crucially, we have some very sort of big draconian powers that we can shut a clinic down or suspend the service, but we have very little else in between, if you like, doing not very much and taking really draconian steps. And if you look at other regulators that have come into healthcare and other areas of public life since we were found, they often these days have a much more subtle range of powers. So, for example, the Care Quality Commission, which looks after hospitals in England, that can actually levy a fine, for example, against a hospital for failure to do something properly. And why does this matter from a patient perspective? I think it matters really because you know, it's the kind of powers that the regulator has that allows us to shape the services that are offered. And one of the problems with having just a range of, if you like, very severe powers is, although there are things wrong in the clinic that we'd like to take action on, they're not severe enough to warrant shutting the clinic down. So we find ourselves stuck with powers that, if you like, are almost too strong to use. And instead, what we're trying to do is improve patient care along the way. The next sort of area under this sort of heading of patient safety is, as you can imagine, back in 1990, fertility services took place in a clinic, a physical clinic, and nowhere else. Now, you don't need me to tell you that since then, an awful lot of services related to fertility treatment are now available in sort of allied health clinics or available online and so on. And I think our view is that if you're undergoing fertility treatment, which after all is a difficult and stressful enough process as it is, and you're getting advice from some organization that's not quite your clinic, it would make more sense from the perspective of the patient if we could regulate, if you like, the whole field rather than just the bit where the embryo transfer takes place. So we think there's a case for giving the regulator some broader powers to look at some of these sort of allied services that have grown up about wellness, health supplements, and all of that. And the last thing that in this area that we think is really important is just the whole idea of patient care itself. One of the really surprising things, if you look at the 1990 Act, is it doesn't really mention patients at all. What it's concerned about, and this is clearly important, is the safety of the embryo, if you like. It's got very little to say about the safety of the woman undergoing treatment. And we think actually that an express provision in the Act that actually meant that part of the point of the care being offered by clinics and the rules from the regulator is about patient safety and patient care would actually go a long way to make it easy to regulate in favour of the women undergoing treatment. So that's the first of my themes. The second is donor information. Now, donor treatments have increased a lot in recent years. They now make up about 1/6 of all treatments in this country. And some of you may know that the law was changed a long time ago, back in 2005, such that when somebody born from a donor treatment reaches the age of 18, they're entitled to access to certain information about their genetic parentage. Date of birth, name, last known address. Now, this is information that we all hold. So from, if you add 18 years on to 2005, you get to 2023. So later this year, people who've come of age can start to apply to the HFEA for that information. Now, it's long been felt that the best thing to do with donor treatment is to tell the children born about their origins. Now, we don't know how many people do tell, but since that law was made, changes in social media and in these cheap DNA consumer tests, I don't know if any of you have used things like 23andMe or Ancestry.com. Well, those services, which are growing hugely, now mean that it's actually quite possible to work out who your genetic parents are. And clearly, so, you know, whereas back in 1990, you could only come to the HFEA for that information, you can now get some of that information elsewhere. So we think the time has come to revisit this idea of, if you like, anonymity up until the age of 18. And we're proposing that parents could opt to stay with the existing regime, or they could possibly, and donors would need to change as well, opt for a sort of early identification route in which certain facts of the donor's identity would become available to the family much earlier. So that's the first of my issues there. The second of which is there's a general encouragement that people using donated gametes ought to have available opportunities for implications counselling. So this is not sort of psychiatric counselling or therapy, but it is just counselling about the implications of the decision, including the sorts of things I've talked about now. We think there's a case for strengthening that requirement, given the nature of the information and the sensitivity of it. And more generally, thirdly, making it a requirement for all clinics to actually make sure they inform donors about these new risks that flow from social media and these cheap DNA tests, because they really are changing everything in this field. That brings me on to consent. Now, if any of you have undergone treatment, what you'll know is that consent in a fertility treatment is complex. If any of you have used donation services or a surrogate, you'll know it's particularly complex. And in one sense, there's good reasons for that. It's not just medical treatment in terms of if I hurt my knee and have an operation, the only person who needs to give consent is me. It's my knee. Now, clearly, when you're using IVF services, effectively you're creating a family. There's more than one person involved, and the consent is necessarily complex. And many of you will know it also asks questions. You've come into the clinic just because you want a baby, and people are asking all sorts of questions like, what would you want to happen to your stored gametes if you unfortunately happen to die, and so on. So it's clearly very complex. And one of the things we're trying to get a view on in this consultation is whether or not there are ways of simplifying it. And one possibility is the idea of a sort of effectively an opt-out model, like is happening with many other kinds of donation and the like, in which your consent is presumed unless you actively opt out of certain set models. The other two issues on consent concern what happens to your records. So it's generally good practice in modern medicine these days for the records to follow the patient. Now, fertility services is unique in this, in which your own patient record does not automatically make its way to the maternity services. So if you have treatment in a clinic, and of course it may be a clinic not in where you live, and then you fall ill, and you go to A&E because perhaps you've got something like OHSS or something or other, then automatically the hospital doesn't have access to your records. So there are real issues about patient care there. And then thirdly, there is an issue about research consent. many of you have had treatment may well know that one of the questions that gets asked is, should you have any surplus embryos, would you like to donate them to research? And I'm very conscious that it's probably a very long way away from why you came into the clinic, but actually without research, then treatments can't advance. And at the moment, the law is very restrictive about what kind of research projects an individual can agree to sign up to. And we're suggesting a move to a much more generic kind of research consent, which means if you're comfortable with the idea about embryos being used for research, and obviously you'd need to feel comfortable, they could then be used pretty much for any legitimate research project. And that ought to increase the availability of embryos for research and in time, actually, hopefully improve treatments and patient outcomes. Which brings me neatly to my last theme, which is scientific developments. The science, whether it's in embryo research or around treatments, has moved on enormously in the last 30 years. And the Act, the old law, is pretty rigid and quite difficult to work with. And we think there's a case for trying to make it more flexible and potentially more able to cope with developments in research. And we think we can do that in two kind of ways. One of which is by encouraging the use of using effectively us authorizing trials for low risk new practices. So we can sort of see whether or not these things work actually in the real world. And the second of which is sort of standing back and trying to make the law a bit more flexible. Because if you like, the law inevitably is a rather black and white world in which everything is written down. But of course, science proceeds often quite quickly, and it's very easy for the science and the law to get out of kilter. And we think one of the things we could usefully look to do is to try and future-proof the law so it's better able to respond to these kind of developments over time. So that's all I wanted to say as by way of introduction. I hope that's helpful. You know, my parting message here is a kind of have your say. We are really, really keen to hear from as many people as possible with an interest or experience of fertility services. As I say, all you need to do is go to our website, hfea.gov.uk, and we would love to hear your views. So perhaps I'll stop sharing my screen now, and then we can take some questions.
Oh, thank you very much, Peter. That was really, really interesting. I just wanted to mention, I have put in the chat a link to your survey. So that is in there if anybody would like to use it. I don't know if anybody's joined since I've put that in. So if you have and you want me to pop it in again, just drop me a message in the chat. So I was emailed a question earlier on today, which I'd like to start with, if that's okay. I did run through it with you quickly earlier, and I didn't fully understand the question myself. So if you could explain what the question means and the answer, that would be fantastic, Peter. Thank you. So the question is, would this regulation include researching editing human embryos past the current 14-day cutoff, therefore moving one step closer to discovering what is possible with the safeguard of sandboxing in place to further our understanding of the possibilities?
So there's two separate elements to this. So at present, the law prohibits research on human embryos beyond 14 days. And for many years, it didn't really matter whether 14 days was the right number of days, because nobody could keep an embryo in vitro for that long. Now they can. Now, that doesn't mean we have to change the law, but it does at least mean, I think we need to ask the question. Now, clearly, if you were going to change the law from 14 days as a question to what, because I don't think open-ended research is a good idea, but certainly scientists have talked about extending possibly to 21 or 28 days, and that potentially could open up our understanding of early embryo development, particularly to look at a whole range of things, you know, like miscarriage rates and all sorts of things like that. So what we're not doing in this consultation is saying, do you think the 14-day law rule should change? What we're saying instead is, do you think the law should be made more flexible in order to allow change in future? Now, clearly, if as a result of this consultation, lots of people came back to us and said, we think this general flexibility is a good idea, but actually say 14 days needs to be dealt with sooner rather than later, then we'd have to think about that. But so we're not asking this question explicitly now, but if people want to give us a view, that's fine. But I think we've generally seen this about making the law more flexible. So one possibility is you could change the law in the next couple of years and then possibly look at the 14-day rule, you know, sometime thereafter, and do it as a sort of separate exercise. Now, these sandboxes that you mentioned, Claire, so a number of other regulators have started using this idea. It's like trial approvals. So when we offer a new technique, give approval to a new technique at the moment, effectively, because once we've approved it, we can't unapprove it, if that's even a word. There's a very high bar in order for us to be secure that it's a good idea to make this change. Whereas clearly, you know, these sort of sandboxes is an awful jargony phrase, but the idea is we could give effectively trial approval. So we could say to a clinic, I've got this new piece of equipment we'd like to trial. It looks like low risk. We could allow them to use it under certain conditions for a period of time, look at the data. If it looked promising, then we could open it up more generally. If it didn't, then we could pull it back. And if you think about the debates about these things like these treatment add-ons that have been very much in vogue in the last few years, these sorts of sandboxes would have allowed us to control the introduction of many of those new things in a much more coordinated and sort of evidence-led way than has happened. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. I mean, I'm hoping that the lady who asked it is here. So if you do want to ask any more surrounding that,
yeah, please do
put some more in the notes. While we're on those, talking about the treatment add-ons and things, will those sorts of elements come under regulation? Because I know you have the traffic light system currently in the HFEA, but will there be more ability to regulate these add-ons with these changes? Because I think people can.
I think so. So you're right. So what we do at present, we have no direct powers to alter whether they're offered. So the route we've taken is one of sort of public information, if you like. So we're not against add-ons one way or the other. What we're in favour of is new things that work. And at present, the evidence is pretty mixed, to say the least. And so what we're keen to do is the traffic lights is a way of sort of saying we have an independent experts look at the evidence base and give us a view about whether or not there's good quality evidence that suggests that they work. And all we're testing there is, do they make you have, you know, do you have a greater chance of having a baby? Which seems to us in the end to be the point that matters. So the sorts of things we're talking about that would make a difference is, for example, if we had an overriding commitment in the Act, for example, to regulate in the interest of good patient care, then when there was clear evidence that one of these add-ons, for example, was potentially risky or dangerous, that would give us the sorts of powers to intervene and so on. So, you know, as I say, what we're not trying to do is just stop them per se, because if they work, great. But what we particularly want to stop is overclaiming, I think, above all else. So yes, I think the short answer to your question is yes, but I think, but particularly then to stop things that actually might cause harm.
Okay, that's interesting to know. And probably sort of following on from that question as well, and I'm sure it's a question that everybody is asking, is will there be any move within this, these new laws and regulations to be able to standardize costing across the country?
Yeah, that's a really good question, isn't it? So in one sense, I'd be really interested to hear from patients what they think. So we've currently got no powers at all to regulate price. Many of you might know that we've done some work with the Competition and Markets Authority, who've got in charge of consumer law, and also the Advertising Standards Authority, to try and encourage a bit more transparency about prices. So at least people have a clear sense of what it is they're actually signing up to, and will these prices actually change, and all the rest of it. So we'd really like to hear from you actually about whether or not you think things like standardizing prices or price regulation of some sort is the sort of thing that patients would want. So it's quite a tricky area, because you know, it's very difficult to know exactly at what level you ought to. Some clinics, for example, don't they? They give you a sort of all-in price, and others itemize every item. So it's you end up with a sort of apples and oranges comparison. But we'd really like to hear from patients what they think about price regulation.
Is that included in your survey?
It isn't, but there's plenty of space for free text boxes. So
Okay.
if you want to do and while you're about it, we'd really love to see some stronger action on prices. We'd like to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly and not surprisingly, the comment has come in about the postcode lottery with the NHS in relation to this as well. And I wonder whether some sort of standardization of costings would then enable the NHS to be a little bit more
quite
standard as well.
Quite possibly. I'm afraid there's nothing we can do that can help with NHS commissioning, which in England is clearly, I mean, I can well understand how frustrated people are. It seems totally unfair that you live in one town and you can get 3 cycles, and you live in another, you can get 1, and yet your prognosis is exactly the same. It is a real problem, but it's a local commissioning decision, and I'm afraid we can't control those.
Yeah, it is. It's a very sore point, and this comments
so.
about Northern Ireland are coming in as well. We recognise Northern Ireland is not great at all. So
no.
Be assured, everybody.
Scotland is generally a bit. Scotland is certainly markedly better than the other 3 parts of the UK, for sure.
Absolutely, I think so. And be assured that it's Fertility Network UK's primary objective to fight
I'm not at all surprised.
Fairness,
I mean, to be clear, although we have no powers, we think it's wholly unfair. And I'm keen to say so at every available opportunity.
Excellent. We've got it on recording, Peter. So while we're talking about the survey as well, and asking people for their feedback, there are comments come through about the fact that we haven't got as many people here this evening as we were hoping to have, and how is this survey actually going to reach people to make sure that their voices are being heard? Is there anything else beyond the survey that is taking place?
We're doing quite a lot of social media.
Okay.
We're doing quite a lot of social media. We're also getting people to sort of retweet, particularly people who've got lots of followers and the like. Everything from the Science Museum to all sorts of other organizations. We got 270 pieces of media coverage on the launch day. Our chair did Woman's Hour, I did Radio 4 Night, Claire Ettinghausen, as some of you may have heard talk, I think did LBC. So we're trying to do all of that too. If any of you have got social media followers and you want to, pass on the link, please do. We're hoping, and we've got quite decent responses so far. So I'm hoping, frankly, the more the merrier. So if anybody wants to retweet, Instagram, anything else, please do.
Brilliant. So public consultation is focused predominantly on the survey. You're not running any sort of focus groups, or are you working with clinics as well on this?
Yes, but again, we're expecting them to come in, and perhaps it might help to say a little bit about what we plan to do after this. So obviously we'd like as wide a range of views as possible. But if you like, it's not a vote. So what we won't do is say, oh, look, 51% of people liked X, therefore we're going to do X. It's rather, what we want to do is get a feel for where people are on any of these issues, so that then informs the deliberations of my board, if you like, the authority, as they think about the advice they put to the Department of Health. Now, clearly, if lots of people support a proposal, that's relatively straightforward. If the authority decide that, despite the fact that 60% of people liked X, they'd like to recommend Y, they're going to have to justify and set out why they do that. But what we will do is make public, sort of aggregates of the views. Where relevant, we'll probably divide those up between, what did patients say, or what did people who are involved in donation say, what did people who work in clinics say, and so on. So it'll all be very clear as to where the views are, and we will make our utmost to make sure that we anonymize comments and the like, because so nobody need fear that we, just because they wrote a very interesting comment, we'll suddenly name them in anything later on. But that's sort of how things develop.
Okay, thank you. And can I just ask how you guys have sort of identified the areas that you think need to be looked at and changed?
So I think there are a couple of things here. I mean, you remember at the start I said we set up an advisory group involving, people who work in clinics, people involved in research, patient representatives. There's a philosopher on there, a lawyer, so one thing was to take the temperature, if you like, of experts. And by experts, I also include people who've had treatment themselves. I think that's absolutely crucial. And we have a patient stakeholder group, and we talk to them. We have a similar sort of clinic group. And the other thing, in a way, that's led us to identify this is, in a way, we know this law better than anyone. Our daily bread and butter is trying to make this law work for the benefits of patients and the regulatory scheme generally. So, if we don't know where it works and where it doesn't work, then, we're not doing our job properly. So it's partly about our reflections on managing this law for 30 years, and also through talking to others with expertise or an interest.
Thank you. So in terms of the real significant changes for patients in these laws, and the changes for your regulations, you said those 4 main areas of patient safety, access to donor information, consent, and science. How does this really change things for those people that just want to have a baby and get their dream come true? Exactly. What does this really mean to them?
That's a very good point. In one sense, all 4 of them have an impact on patients. Some of them much more directly than others. So clearly, the changes to consent, all patients have to consent. So anything we can do to simplify that or something will have a direct bearing on patients. It won't get them a child any quicker, but it will do that. And equally, those sorts of elements of consent in terms of, by making your patient records more neatly follow into the hospital care and the like, that's a proper patient safety measure, and so on. The sorts of the things that would have a direct impact on patient care are the ones I started with, the ones about patient safety and regulatory rules, because clearly, the point of regulation is not just to obey rules, it's to make the care better. And if we can, and there's lots of great care happening out there, whether it's in the NHS or private, but where the care is not good enough, it's through regulation that we can identify that and either make it improve, or if it's so bad, shut it down. And it's obviously in everyone's interest that they get access to safe, good quality care. So although I know that nobody who starts fertility treatment is much interested in the regulatory rules of the regulator, it's those rules that have a direct bearing on the quality of care you get. The donor information stuff clearly only relates really to people using donor services anyway. And crucially, it only relates to people who are successful, because you can't have access to donor information if you're not successful. I suppose the last thing, that the scientific stuff may seem the furthest away from patient care, but in many respects, it's one of the most important, because the honest truth is, it's only through research that we get improvements in treatments. And I know it's exactly your point, Claire. If you go into a clinic, we all know why you're there. It's because you want a baby, and you desperately want a baby. And somebody's asking you about, would you consent to research and all the rest of it? And I know it seems completely distant from what you want. But actually, without things like donating surplus embryos to research, the treatments can't get better. It's only through the research that we learn more. So in a way, one of the things I often say to patients is the research seems very distant and not really related to your predicament, but actually it's pretty central. And it may not benefit you directly, because hopefully, because the research takes many years to have effect. But it's only earlier groups of patients who gave their consent to research that's helped the treatments develop as they are. So there's a bit of a virtuous circle here, in which, by as well as going for a much needed baby, you also consent to research, means that other patients in future have got increased chances of getting that much wanted for baby. So, the short answer to your question is we think all of these proposals have some kind of connection to patient care.
Thank you. Just going on the research you mentioned as well about implications counselling in
Yeah.
relation to the scientific research and the consent.
Yes.
And I just wonder whether there's a move to implement that implications counselling right at the early stages when you're dealing with those consent forms, because in personal experience, felt very much that the consent forms are put in front of you right at the start of the treatment when you don't really understand what it is you're filling in. And that counselling isn't really offered until maybe further down the line when the implications of what you've consented to are actually taking effect. And I wonder whether that's sort of part of the move that you're looking at doing with these regulations, is combining those.
So the implications counselling was sort of specifically in there because of the issues around donation.
Oh, okay.
But you make a really good point, which is really the point about consent is not filling forms in, it's the conversation. Really, the forms are just a record of a conversation. And what a good clinic ought to be doing is sitting down with you at the start of treatment and sort of saying almost, look, I know this isn't the reason why you came in, but I need to talk to you about, the various kind of issues that flow from having started treatment, and actually taking a bit of time with everybody to explain, why this may not be the first thing you thought about, but actually why it's quite important. It's not about persuading people to make decisions, but I think taking the time with them so they get a clear sense of, why they're even being asked these questions at all, quite frankly. You've come in for a baby and somebody's asking you about donating surplus embryos and you haven't even got any embryos yet. So, I think clinics need to give the time for a proper conversation. That's the real thing, not the paperwork, it's the conversation.
I agree with that entirely, Peter. And actually, someone's laughing at that, because what I was going to ask you was actually, how do you receive the paperwork with the consent?
Yes.
But how do you regulate that those conversations are taking place? And this
So
lady says she was sent a link and given a deadline.
yeah, that's a very good point. So you're right, we get the paperwork. We check on inspection. Sometimes our inspectors observe, with the patient's permission, might observe consent being taken and so on. But you're absolutely right. We can't be there every day. And in a way, we can't do clinics' jobs for them. And I think that is a genuine issue. I'm not trying to make excuses here. One of the problems when you're a regulatory body is, you can set some rules, you can inspect, etc., but you're not there every day. And we just have to keep going on at clinics about doing this properly, and not just in the case, as you say, the comment on the line, just sending a load of things and saying, oh, fill these in. They are a record of a conversation, not an end in themselves.
Okay, thank you. Laura has asked if she can just say something about patient care, if that's okay. I'm just going to invite her to speak. Thanks, Laura.
Hi. Yeah, sorry, thanks for letting me have the opportunity to speak. I think the patient care thing could go potentially further. Obviously, there is very rightly the focus on patient safety, and obviously that's the absolute minimum that we require. But I do think that a lot of clinics kind of operate on the assumption, and also, I guess, the benchmark they're expected to achieve is nobody dies and there's an acceptable number of babies born, right? But given that this is such an emotional journey, and the journey itself is so emotional, how clinics actually treat people and the emotional safety of the patients during that treatment is so important. And I will say 75% of my emotional anguish through this process has been through the processes and the ways my clinic has treated me, and the lack of information and the lack of transparency and the zero contact and neglect and just nobody explaining anything. Is there any scope for you to regulate that sort of thing? And I don't know how you would, because it is quite subjective, but I just know that it's not meeting an acceptable standard, because I'm not the only person. I've spoken to so many people, particularly in my clinic, because we're in Northern Ireland, there's only a certain number of clinics, so we all, there's going to be a good number of people in each of the clinics that you're talking to. And they've experienced very, very similar things and very similar emotions throughout it. I've had to have 2 sets of counselling just because of the process.
I think you make a really good point. I think there is more we can do. And I think we do see patient care in a slightly wider element than just, as you say, safety. Safety is obviously really important, but it is not the be all and end all. You're right. And we do get complaints from patients exactly, I think, saying, sort of summarizing very similar experiences in which patients have already complained to their clinic, they've not had a satisfactory resolution, and often they're expressing exactly what you've just described, Laura, which is a sort of sense of being treated in a sort of thoughtless, I don't know what the right words are, but in which difficult information was not conveyed sensitively, in which there weren't proper offers of support, and so on. And I think it's not easy to write rules for something, as you say, as subjective as that. But I think we do see patient care, and I haven't, I'm not sure this is absolute wording for a revised law, but I think we do see patient care as being wider than just safety. And I think part of looking after patients properly is also providing proper emotional support for them.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear. And even something so simple as making sure that every piece of information that's given is explained in plain English, and they don't just throw numbers at you and expect you to understand
exactly
what that means in practice.
Exactly.
Even
no, go on. Sorry.
I was going to say, even something as simple as your AMH. I was told a number, and I was told it was good or okay or something like that. And then the more I look at it, actually, I'm at the lower end for my age, and I think I did probe on it at some stage, and then maybe did admit that. But I wasn't given the full information. It wasn't explained to me. It's sort of expected that I would go away and look that up and find out what that actually meant. And I don't think that should be the case whenever we're all lay people, we're not doctors,
I'm with you entirely here. I think it is absolutely the responsibility of doctors and nurses to explain technical matters. And my advice to anybody undergoing treatment is, if you don't understand, say so there and then. I couldn't agree more. I think, giving somebody a number, and what does that, somebody turns around and says it's 6. Well, what does that mean? 6 what?
Does that answer your question, Laura?
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's really, really good to know that their position on that. So yeah, I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. While we're on that, so where we were saying about being able to give that information to patients, is that something that you guys can regulate? Is that something that would be included in your patient safety elements?
Well, it's probably more a matter. So one of the things we're required to do by law is publish what's called a code of practice. You can find it on our website, and effectively it's a sort of book of guidelines for clinics. It's designed for clinics, and it tries to set out what good looks like. And that does have things in there about this sort of thing. So the difficulty is moving beyond guidance, if you like, to rules. And I'm not trying to make excuses, but it's very difficult to write the law for something quite so subjective. But I think the general point is really well made, that care is not just about safety. It's about, it's rather similar to my answer to your point about consent. It's about explaining things properly. It's about being sensitive to the person you're talking to. It's about asking them whether or not they understand what they've just been told. It's about asking them whether they need time or an opportunity to talk to somebody else, and so on. It's all the things about, it's a bit of imagination, quite frankly, that we treat people as we'd like to be treated ourselves.
Absolutely. And I know you do have very strong opinions with clinics about their emotional support for patients, and you do encourage that. I guess it just comes down to whether the ability to actually regulate that and make sure it's happening.
So I think one of the things that's really difficult is, it seems to me that in the end, for example, counselling, I don't see how you can make counselling compulsory. It's a voluntary, some people will want it, some people won't. And of course, that's part of the difficulty here, isn't it? For some patients, they will want a great deal of additional support, and others may not. And that's not to say one is good and one is bad. It's a question of what's right for the individual. And that's the difficulty. It's very difficult to make laws that apply when individuals differ so much. But rest assured, at things like inspection and the like, and certainly when we get complaints in this sort of territory, we go back to clinics quite hard and sort of try and understand and get them to understand that they've clearly let this individual down.
That's good to know. And someone did advise me to do your clinic, I can't think what you call it, like the survey when you've used a clinic, the patient survey. So do take part in those.
We have a look at those. It's 5 really straightforward questions. I can't remember. I ought to know what they are and I can't. But I mean, they do include things like price. So we don't ask exactly what the price is, but what we do say crucially is, did you pay what you expected?
Yeah.
Because we get lots of people who started, saying, well, I was told it was £5,000, and by the time I finished, it was 10, and I couldn't quite work out how 5 had become 10. And I think that's the kind of crucial thing.
I think that's quite common as well. We hear that a lot. Yeah. Somebody's asked a question about waiting times and waiting lists. Do they come under HFE regulations? NHS, unfortunately.
Very much the NHS, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I understand the frustration.
Yeah. So you spoke briefly about inspectors and your inspections as well. And would there be changes to the ways you're going to be carrying out inspections, or things that you're going to be looking for as part of these changes to law?
So possibly. So at present, we are required by law to inspect that, and we're required to do it at least once every 2 years. And that's regardless of whether the clinic is a brilliant clinic or really one that needs an awful lot of help to improve. And one of the things we're sort of in this consultation is we think we ought to have a bit more flexibility over this. That's not because we don't want to inspect, but we'd rather spend more of our resources on clinics that are poorly performing than spend, if you like, the same amount of resource on the very good clinics as well as the poorly performing clinics. So one of the things we're sort of suggesting in this is, rather than a hard and fast rule where we have to go every 2 years, we might, if a clinic's really well performing really well, we might, for example, not go back every 2 years, but go back after 3 or 4 years, say, and go back more frequently to poorly performing clinics. So we'd like to put more of our inspection effort into those clinics that need to improve, rather than those clinics that are self-evidently performing really well. But we do think inspections are still quite valuable, partly because we get to see, it's not all on the paperwork, if you like, or the data. We actually get to see the care being given on the ground, and we can talk to patients, and that's really helpful.
Absolutely. And do you think you would rely a bit more heavily on the feedback you'd be getting from clinics on your website if there's a bigger gap going on?
Possibly. I mean, we're really keen. I mean, it'd be great if every patient, it would take about 5 minutes. I mean, it's the simplest thing around. And I know clinics often ask for feedback forms, but we don't get to see those in the same kind of way. And we've just got 5 quick headline indicators about, the care you received, the price you paid, and so on and so forth. And yes, that's exactly the sort of thing we'd like to be. If we got more of that, we could monitor it more actively. And then if we started to see, for example, a number of patients clearly unhappy about the care they got, that would be exactly the sort of trigger that might cause us to go back in. You want to be a bit more responsive, if you like, rather than just wait for every 2 years. We'd like to actually sort of see a spike in complaints or something and think, right, we need to go in and have a look at what's going on.
Great. Okay. Well, that's interesting to know. Are you able to request to see the feedback forms for the clinics that they receive?
Yes, we can, but we don't get them in the same way as we get.
You don't have to. They don't have to send them.
Yeah, that's the point.
Okay.
The ones that the 5 key points we see all the time.
That's interesting. Angard has just very kindly, Angarad, sorry, I don't know if I've pronounced your name correctly, but has very kindly just shared a link to the Rate Your Clinic page on your website. So anybody that wants to give their feedback, please do.
Please do.
We have another question from Laura. Laura, do you want to ask this question? Because it's quite long. I wondered if you just want to say it. Is it easier, or would you rather I read it out? Let's see what Laura says. I'll get you to say it, Laura, if you don't mind. I'll just quickly unmute you. There we are. Sorry. Right. Thanks, Laura.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I feel like I'm the
Don't be sorry.
needy person tonight.
Not
So
at all.
this is a genuine question because it's something that caused a lot of hassle for me this year because of the previous law change. I'm just wondering, is there a possibility to separate the donor consents as they are for people who are actually planning to donate from those who have just ticked the box on the form to say, yes, if I were to unfortunately die and I still had embryos, I want to allow my husband to do what he wants with them in order to preserve their life. And previously, even though that wasn't an option, because you weren't ticking a box to say, no, my husband is not allowed to use them, then your husband always had the opportunity, if that was to unfortunately happen, to fight in the courts, or as was recommended to us at the time, because it's very important to us that we didn't destroy embryos. It was recommended to us by the embryologist that we actually just physically wrote at the top of the form, I actually give my consent should this unfortunately 1 in a million thing happen. Because of the law change on the 1st of July, we were then pulled into the actual donor process, which we're not planning to do. We're not planning to donate our embryos. It's not part of our immediate plans. But because there was no other process, this is what actually happened. So our treatment was delayed because we had to go through consents, different consents.
Right.
We've then had to have multiple bloods taken, and was forced. I was told at one stage it only just had to happen before I died, but I was forced to have them on specific days, which disrupted a lot of my plans. And pay for those bloods because the NHS doesn't cover it. We're also being told we're going to have implications counselling, which I don't really understand because I'll be dead. So, like, what am I going to care? They keep sending me, oh, but how are you going to feel if another woman is carrying your baby or your husband gets married? I'm like, I'll be dead. The only way this is going to kick in is if I die, and if I'm dead, I'm not going to know what's going on, and I'm really not going to care. So I feel like there's two very, very different scenarios there. One is for people who are actually actively planning to donate while they're living and all of this, and there's people who just want to keep the path open because they don't want their embryos to definitely die if they die. I know I'm using harsh language, I probably should use perish, and I'm sorry. I know I don't mean that for that to be triggering or anything like that to people. But I do think they're two very, very distinct cases. And the sort of person who would carry that sort of an embryo as a surrogate is probably going to do it because they believe in the same things as you believe, and they might, be prepared to go, not worry as much about I don't really know, but I do think there's two separate routes, and is there the opportunity to now that you're rethinking this whole thing, divide those two situations up into different consents is what I'm trying to ask. I'm sorry I've laboured the point.
No, that's absolutely fine. So I was going to say two things. One of which is I'll try and give you a short answer now, but if you'd like a longer conversation and wanted to put it in an email, I could get something to kind of to talk to you at more length. So the current forms, so you're right. So the law on storage consents in effect changed, the Department of Health changed the law this year. And all of the new forms reflect the law as it's currently written. So I'm not trying to make excuses here, but the law, we didn't make the law, they made the law, and we've just had to come up with forms that fit the law. Now, the consultation we're doing at the moment does sort of reopen the question about how it might be better to organise consent. And I was going to suggest one of two things. If you can bear it, if you want to let us know through the consultation process about this kind of issue and how you think it might better be resolved, then we'd love to hear from you. If you just want to send me an email, I can easily put that on to somebody else who can give you a sort of properly sort of detailed answer. But I don't know if either of those would be useful, Laura.
Yeah, I mean, I think I did fill in the consultation, but it wouldn't be a bad idea. I had written out something at the time that I sent to somewhere. I don't know where I sent it at the time. This is before you were talking about changing the law, so I can definitely forward that on to you if that would be helpful. Yeah,
please do. Or yes, exactly. So literally, so it's Peter.Thompson. That's THOMPSON at hfea.gov.uk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I did send you my email address as well, so I can forward anything on.
Yeah, that would be fine. That might be simpler, actually. Just go to Claire and Claire can send to me.
That's fine. We've had a question in the Q&A that's come through asking about BMA requirements for clinics. Is that something that you guys regulate, or would you change the law to have the
Sorry,
power?
about what requirements?
BMI requirements in terms of people's weight.
That'll be that's part of the NICE fertility guidelines.
That's NICE guidelines.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
thank
age,
you.
BMI, etc., etc. It's all in NICE guidelines.
Okay, I can share a link for the NICE guidelines if you would like them. Anonymous attendee, just pop me a little message and I can share those with you. Okay, so I think we've got through all our questions. The only thing I would ask, Peter, is whether you have a timescale for when these changes may or may not be implemented.
If only. Right. So, so this bit we're in control of. So, you know, we could write the consultation document. We've talked to the Department of Health about the necessity for reform. We're going out to consult. As I say, closes on the 14th of April, I think that's right. So if you haven't yet filled it in, please do. hfea.gov.uk. Then what happens is we will then analyse all of the responses, and we will be discussing with the authority, that's our board, next steps. And at some point we will then, around about the summer, it'll either be before the summer holiday or after the summer holiday, we will then write with some proposals to the Department of Health. At that point, and this is not to criticise the Department of Health, it slightly goes out of our control because it's then up to ministerial decisions. Now, my sense is it is not a state secret that there is an election sometime in 2024, because there just has to be one. So there isn't time to change the law before there will be an election. There just isn't time to, you know, draft new law, get it through Parliament, etc. So we're looking hopefully at law change in the first term of a new Parliament. So realistically, I think that's probably 2025. But that's a decision for the government and possibly even for a new government. So I'm afraid this is a long old process. I wish it were shorter, but you know, it is what it is. But I suppose what I would say is, you know, if you don't start the conversation, you never even get to the end. So this is about starting the conversation, and hopefully we can end up with a modernised fertility law, say in 2025. Now, I know if you're undergoing treatment at the moment, you might respond and say, well, that's a bit late and not very useful. I get that, but we've got to start somewhere.
Absolutely. And sadly, none of us know how long the journey will be. So
Indeed.
It may be relevant as much as
Indeed.
I hope it's
I'm
not to any of you.
I'm afraid to say, actually, it may be a very real question, even in 2025. I do hope not, for all of your sakes, obviously.
Me too. Me too. So, okay, I think that's it. We haven't got any questions that are left. Does anybody have anything that they would like to say before we close up for this evening? Nothing coming in at the moment. So, just want to say a really big thank you, Peter, for giving your time to explain what this means. And I would encourage everybody to share the survey where you can on your own social media. Just encourage as many people as possible that you know that have been on this journey that can really give their opinions and feedback to the HFEA to make sure that you know the regulations change to help everybody as best they can. So I'm just going to pop a little link in here for everybody as well, which is just a link to a feedback form for us. So we'd love to know how you found the session this evening, and if there's anything else that we could be doing differently or anything you particularly enjoyed. We'd love to hear back from you, and I'm sure Peter would love to hear how wonderful he's been. So I'm going to just stop the recording now, and then